Hello and welcome back to the Doomtown Reloaded Beginner Buyer's Guide. I'm your best friend Ryan Nash, and today we're going to be talking about the first saddlebag of Doomtown Reloaded, Newtown New Rules. Saddlebags are the smaller expansions of Doomtown Reloaded. They contain 4 copies of every card in them, and they have a fairly even mix of the different card types. Mostly dudes with some amount of deeds, goods, spells, and actions, and the dudes are split more or less evenly between the different factions and neutrals. This particular saddlebag, Newtown New Rules, I would say is a fairly low priority purchase for a beginning player. It does have cards that support a couple of archetypes. It has very strong options for hex control, specifically noon-based hex control, and it does have some very interesting options for neutral dudes to play skills out of decks that might otherwise not have access to them. And it has some solid role fillers and some values that maybe needed a couple more cards. But on a whole, I would say this is a saddlebag that you could probably hold off on until your collection is more complete. And this is something you could circle back around to unless any specific card in here really calls out to you as something that you're very interested in. So let's go through the set and talk about each individual card. Once again, we have the Doomtown database pulled up. This is sorted by card number, so we're just going to start with card number 1 in this pack, which is Dolph Zug. He is a Fearmonger's dude. He's very cost efficient, but his value is atrocious for this faction. Fearmongers has very little use for aces, and he doesn't have any abilities or keywords, and so Dolph is sort of without a place. He doesn't really have a really strong niche. He is useful if you maybe need a little more influence in your starting posse and you don't already have upkeep, but that's generally only going to be true once you have most of the rest of the game in your hands. He is also useful in Dead Man's Hands decks due to his very good cost to stats ratio and his upkeep, meaning that you can discard him on upkeep when you don't want to keep him anymore. And that is true out of every faction. I would say that Dolph and Lucy and similar dudes are playable in Dead Man's Hands decks in basically any faction. But Dolph isn't really anything to write home about. Slade Liebody similarly suffers from not really filling any particular niche. Huckster 2 is nice, as well as the 2 influence, but his cost is a little high, especially if you only have this box in the core set. Your starting posse is already going to be very expensive, and playing 5s is going to be a tricky proposition. As your collection expands, Slade becomes a little more viable due to lower value hexes being something that you can actually do, as well as that Huckster 2 being more relevant due to the wider variety of deck structures available to you. However, with a small card pool, Slade just doesn't compare to the other hucksters available to you, like Mongwao, and he's just not worth the cost. His ability is more or less useless. There are very rare times that you'll want to use it, and generally, again, just not worth the cost. Rafi Hamid is a perfectly respectable card. 7's a good value. He is very effective cost-wise. He's a deputy. He does have a shootout ability that can matter. It can do a lot for you, but it's very situational. Generally, Rafi is good for his stats and the fact that he has that deputy keyword. He's not going to be in your starting posse necessarily, and 7's isn't the strongest value in Law Dogs, but it is pretty solid, and he's a good candidate for it. Wiley Jenks is pretty expensive. As you can see, his ability is very swingy, it's very powerful potentially, but he's very expensive. 8 cost is so much, and having upkeep on top of that just makes him very difficult to put into play. 2 stud, 2 influence is solid. 8 is a very good value for Law Dogs due to Bounty Hunter and a number of their other dudes being on 8. So altogether, Wiley is good, but he's expensive. He's going to be hard to play. Kyle Wagner. He's cheap, upkeep free Mad Scientist 2. He's going to sit at home and invent things for you. And that's fine. That's really all you need Kyle to do. But if you look through the rest of the things available in the game, Kyle just doesn't really stack up. He doesn't stack up to someone like Diego Linares or any of the mad scientists that do have upkeep. He can fill a role in a starting posse, but outside of that, it's going to be very difficult to find room for Kyle. 2 is not really a value that Mad Science wants to play. It's not a value that Morgan particularly wants to play most of the time. But he can fill that starting posse role very well if you need another Mad Scientist, but you can't really afford upkeep, or you really need that Mad Science 2 to bridge the gap in your deck structure. Kyle can definitely fill a role. Here we see the big king for entrepreneurs. You'll notice in the core set, everybody else got a king with really crazy numbers and really high cost, and instead, entrepreneurs got Max Bane, who is a queen. So Lilian is the actual king here, and she is very similar to the other kings in the core set in that she is very high stats, she has a really powerful ability, but she's incredibly expensive and difficult to play. Generally, I think this version of Lilian is almost unplayable. There are very rare instances in which you will want her, but the experienced Lilian is much more playable. So I would say if you're looking for this card, unless you really, really want that shootout ability, look to Lilian XP. Ulysses Marks is fantastic. I would say he's probably the best dude in this box. 7's a very strong value for Sloan. His stats are very good for his cost. He can have a control point. He puts a control point on the saloon, but he can generate a control point, and he can contest that control point on his own very effectively. So altogether, Ulysses is the complete package. He's not necessarily a dude you want to start, but he's very good in the deck. Alice Stowe, again, really expensive. 7 cost 2 upkeep, very hard to justify. Her numbers are very good. 3 stud 2 influence is nothing to laugh at. Queen is an awkward value for Outlaws, but it is playable. Her trait is very powerful, but it is not super common to come into play. A lot of Outlaws decks will want to just sit in town square. Alice does let you spread out a little bit more safely, but altogether, she's just too expensive. Here are the interesting dudes in this box. Wilbur Crowley and the next dude, Roderick Crowley, are functionally the same. They have very similar values, similar stats, blank text boxes, except for skill 1. So Wilbur here is a huckster 1, but he is a drifter, he's neutral, so you can play spells out of any faction. You can start Wilbur Crowley and play hexes out of any faction. Is this good? Probably not. But it is interesting, and it does open up a lot of options for you. Roderick does the same thing for you in Mad Science. He's 1 higher value, but other than that, basically the same dude as Wilbur. He's going to be your starting Mad Scientist. I will say that Roderick is more likely to see play, especially if you have just this and the core set, due to being an upkeep-free Mad Scientist. And so him with Kyle gives you 2 upkeep-free Mad Scientists in Entrepreneurs and lets you have a lot more of your starting money invested in other dudes. So Roderick and Wilbur are solid, but there are better options in faction for the factions that want to do these things later. For drifters, they're hard to beat. Town Council's a 2 cost 1 production, 1 control deed, which means that it is automatically good. 4 value desperately wants this. The deeds on 4 are not very good, and so Town Council is probably the best deed on 4, even still. The ability has some very strong interactions with the Morgan Cattle Company home and the Law Dogs home. Both of those outfit cards rely on influence and can make for some very explosive first plays combined with Town Council. That government keyword is also relevant. So altogether, Town Council, very good. R&D Ranch is awkward. The experimental keyword is something that is generally not worth playing around. It requires a lot of either risk or building your deck around mitigating that risk. The best thing about R&D Ranch is it is an out-of-town deed with control, It is also a ranch, which means that it can benefit from a lot of card effects. The ability on it is fine if you're willing to take the risk or build your deck to mitigate that experimental downside. But blowing itself up is pretty scary. Wasting that 3 Ghost Rock from building the R&D Ranch is potentially devastating. Telepathy Helmet is interesting. It's very passive. It doesn't actually do anything active to affect the board, and its value is significantly lower than its difficulty, making it difficult to put it into a deck unless you have a very strong mad scientist, like Kyle Wagner, who we saw earlier. Being able to protect your dudes from other players' shootout abilities is strong, but this is conditional on you winning lowball. The ability to look at other players' hands is also strong, but it costs additional Ghost Rock. So Telepathy Helmet is interesting, and it can be powerful, but it is very situational. Faithful Hound is just generally really good. Goods are some of the best cards in the game. They have some really strong, repeatable effects. And Faithful Hound, if you build your deck to support it, can deal with just about any good in the game. The fact that it's a sidekick is just an extra bonus. 3 cost is a little steep, but Faithful Hound is one of the best goods on 4, and a very strong option for any low-value deck. Plasma Drill is almost completely unplayable. Its value is very low for a gadget, its difficulty is rather high compared to its value. Its cost is ridiculous. Paying 4 for this is absurd. You could buy a whole other dude, a deed or 2. You could get a lot of value out of 4 Ghost Rock. And having to pay to activate that ability, as well as booting the dude that the gadget is attached to, all to fire an effect that your opponent can then ignore if they can just pay enough Ghost Rock, is just not worth it. I see that this card would be an extremely negative play experience if it didn't have all these restrictions on it, but as it is, this card is just unplayable. It doesn't really do anything. Paralysis Mark is very strong. It has actually been errated. If you buy an original printing of Newtown New Rules, it will have incorrect wording. The version in the box will say, Noon Hex X boot, X is the value of a dude at this or an adjacent location. The adjacent location targeting has been removed. So now it can only target dudes at the same location. It's still very good, though. Being able to boot a dude as a noon action, almost unconditionally if you build your deck right, is very strong. And this is a very powerful tool in the Hex Control toolbox. You can get errated copies as promos, so keep an eye out for that. Birgit is another strong Noon Hex. Removing abilities from dudes can be potentially game-changing, and the fact that it is a free Hex on Jack plays very well with Hex Slingin'. So altogether, Birgit is a really good option. Its high value makes it playable in just about every Hex deck. So Birgit is definitely a strong contender. Make 'em Sweat is kind of awkward. Ace is not a particularly strong value, and this card has a lot of riders. You have to boot your dude to use it. It reduces bullet rating by your bullet rating, so you have to have enough bullets on your dude to make it worthwhile. And it only boots the opposing dude if you can reduce them to 0 bullets. So altogether, I would say this card is mostly worse than something like Pistol Whip or Sun in Your Eyes. It does have its uses, and if you're really determined to play aces as a strong value, Make 'em Sweat can be a good option for your club. Backways is interesting. There's only really 2 factions that can make a lot of use out of it. Outlaws has a lot of dudes that care about being wanted, and a couple of ways of making their own dudes wanted. And this is a very strong card for them, being a just unconditional movement ability, going from any location to any other location without booting. The other faction that can get a lot of mileage out of this is actually Law Dogs. You can use the Law Dogs outfit to make your own dudes wanted, and then use all of that same wanted tech, things like Backways or Bad Company, on your own dudes. which can be very powerful, but this is a restrictive card, and 2, once again, is kind of an awkward value, and already has a very strong club in bottom dealing. Hired Help is almost completely unplayable. 7 is a very strong value on clubs already, and having a 3-cost shootout action that just creates a token is not particularly good. Most of the time this card will be pay 3 Ghost Rock, soak 2 casualties, because you will lose the shootout and have to ace the token. Sometimes a 2-stud token can swing things in your favor, especially if you build your deck around it. You're playing things like Point Blank or Outgunned or other effects that will let you really capitalize on having an extra stud in your posse. But generally, if your posse is weak enough in the shootout that a 2-stud would make a huge difference, you should be playing a card that will let you level the playing field more effectively. Even something like Pin Down might be better than Hired Help. And if you are good at shooting, if your deck has strong shootout capabilities, Hired Help isn't going to add much to that. An extra stud is not very helpful if you're winning, as he'll generally only add a single card to your draw hand. You'll have a better stud to use. And if you're winning the shootout, the other benefit of the token, in that it can soak casualties, is pointless. Too Much Attention is another club in this set that competes on a very strong value. 10 has access to some very powerful effects, the strongest of which generally being Unprepared, and Too Much Attention definitely competes in a similar realm. The difference here being, a very key difference, that Too Much Attention is a noon action as opposed to a shootout action. This is a meta card. This is something you play when you are expecting certain deck types. It has a strong home in Law Dogs due to the Law Dogs outfit enabling that Boot a Wanted Dude text. You can use Too Much Attention as a strong board control piece. This is also a very strong anti-Outlaws card. If you are expecting to see a lot of Outlaws, you can use Too Much Attention as a counter to those decks, because it will let you boot any dudes that have control points from, let's say, the Sloan Gang outfit, or the Desolation Row outfit, or Protection Racket, or any of the Outlaws dudes that give themselves control points. It lets you boot Allie Hensman before she can use her ability to gain more control points. It lets you boot Deeds that have control points. Too Much Attention is a flexible card. It does a lot of things, but it is not always the correct answer. There are a lot of times where this card will be completely dead if you don't build around it or you're not up against the correct matchup. And with that, we've completed our beginner buyer's guide review of Newtown New Rules. Altogether, this is a set that does have some interesting and powerful cards, but they are mostly niche or otherwise underwhelming compared to other options that exist in the game. Generally, I would say that this is a least priority purchase, that this is something you should get when you're looking to finish your collection and just have all of the options available to you. As a beginning player, I think you can safely skip this one until later, unless you really want to play Hex Control or some kind of Law Dogs control variant. Otherwise, the things in this pack are fairly replaceable. There are other options on the same values or that do the same things, but in a different way. Something I'm going to be doing for the beginner buyer's guide is creating deck lists using 2 copies of the base set and that individual expansion. So this is a list using cards from Newtown New Rules to build Hex Control out of the 4th Ring outfit. There's a detailed description on the database deck list, and you can follow the link in the description or click here to look at it. If you want to see video breakdowns of these deck lists, I can definitely do that. Just let me know in the comments. As always, if you liked the video, leave us a thumbs up. If you hated it, leave us a thumbs down. Either way, we want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Please like and subscribe to the channel, and we will be back next time with Double Dealin', the next Saddlebag Doomtown Reloaded.